This entire monument to your inadequacy is coming down, Mr. Caldwell. I will personally see to it that a bulldozer reduces it to dust, and I will bill you for every single glorious second of it." The voice was a grating symphony of entitlement and cheap perfume, a sound that could curdle milk from 50 paces. It belonged to Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association, a woman whose physical presence was matched only by the sheer mass of her ego. She stood just on her side of my property line, her floral print muumuu straining against the humid Carolina air, a clipboard clutched in her hand like a scepter of judgment. The monument she was referring to wasn't some gaudy statue or an unapproved shed. It was the 25-yard state-of-the-art shooting range I had just spent 6 months in a significant portion of my retirement savings to build on my own 15-acre property. The backstop was a massive earthen berm, 20 feet high and 40 feet thick, engineered to stop anything short of an anti-tank round. The side berms were just as robust, and the whole structure was nestled in a natural depression at the far end of my land, over a half-mile from her house and completely invisible from any road or common area. I had designed it myself using every bit of the knowledge I'd gained over 25 years as a combat engineer in the Army Corps of Engineers. It was safe, it was professional, and it was mine. Her face was a mask of smug certainty, the kind worn by people who have never been told no tukish in their lives and fully intend to keep it that way. Her eyes, small and buried in puffy flesh, scanned my creation with undisguised contempt. This wasn't about noise or safety. This was about power. It was about the fact that I had built something she hadn't approved, on land she mistakenly believed she controlled. Her threat hung in the air, thick and oily, a promise of destruction aimed right at the heart of the peace I had worked my entire life to secure. If you've ever had a nightmare neighbor or an HOA from hell, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. You're not going to want to miss how this ends. This little patch of heaven, or what was supposed to be, was the culmination of a lifelong dream. After 2.5 decades of living in government quarters, of deployments to places where the only scenery was sand and concrete barriers, I wanted trees. I wanted space. I wanted a place where I could hear myself think, a sanctuary for my wife Sarah, and a legacy for my son Mark, who was just about to ship off to basic training, following the muddy boot prints I'd left for him. I found this plot before Lakeside Meadows was anything more than a developer's blueprint in a fancy sign on the highway. 15 acres of rolling woodland, bordered by a state-owned creek on one side. Crucially, I bought it as a standalone parcel, a carve-out from the larger tract the developer was planning to subdivide. My lawyer at the time, a shrewd old country attorney named Silas, had gone over the deeds and plats with a magnifying glass. "Your land, Jack," he'd said, tapping the survey map with a leathery finger, "is an island. They can build their little kingdom of beige houses all around you, but they can't touch you. Your deed predates their covenants. You are not, and will never be, part of their association unless you sign on that dotted line." I never signed. I built my house slowly, deliberately, a sturdy brick rancher set 1,000 feet back from the road. We moved in, and for a few years it was perfect. The development grew, the cookie-cutter houses marching up the hill towards my property line, but they kept their distance. Then they formed the HOA, and Karen, a resident from day one with an unslakable thirst for control, was elected president in perpetuity. The shooting range was the final piece of my puzzle. It was a place for me to maintain the skills I'd spent a lifetime honing, a hobby that required discipline and focus. More than that, it was a place for me and Mark. I wanted to pass on the tradition of responsible marksmanship, to teach him safety and respect for the tool, lessons he would carry with him into his own service. I did everything by the book, and then some. I consulted with a sound engineer to design baffles and position the range to minimize noise. I met with the county sheriff, showed him my plans, and got his informal sign. I filed for and received every necessary permit from the county planning office. It was a fortress of legality and safety. And now, this woman who ruled over a kingdom of manicured lawns and matching mailboxes was standing at my border, threatening to bring it all crashing down because it offended her sense of absolute authority. I looked from her smug face to the distant berm, the product of my sweat and planning, a place of peace and purpose. An old feeling settled over me, one I hadn't felt since my last tour. The cold, quiet clarity that comes when a line has been drawn and an enemy has declared their intentions. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a retiree in a faded ball cap. She was about to meet the man who designed forward operating bases under enemy fire. The campaign had just begun. My first response was not to shout back across the property line, nor was it to engage in the petty war of words she so clearly craved. My training, both in the military and in life, had taught me that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. True power lies in precision, in documentation, and in the calm, methodical application of overwhelming force at the decisive point. Karen wanted a screaming match. I was going to give her a legal dissertation. I went back inside, poured a tall glass of iced tea, and sat down at my desk. Sarah came in, her face etched with concern. "What was all that about, Jack?" I heard her from the kitchen. I relayed Karen's threat, the promise of bulldozers and dust. Sarah's hands tightened on the back of my chair. She knew how much this place and that range meant to me, to us. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm going to do what engineers do, honey," I said, pulling a fresh legal pad from my drawer. "I'm going to build a case, piece by piece, until the structural integrity of her argument collapses under its own weight." A week later, the first official salvo arrived by certified mail. It was a thick envelope with the ostentatious Lakeside Meadows logo embossed in gold. Inside was a 5-page letter detailing my alleged crimes against the community. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. The range was an unapproved structure, a violation of Article 9, Section 4 of the HOA Covenants. It created excessive noise and disturbance, a violation of Article 6, Section 2. It constituted a hazardous and noxious activity, a violation of Article 7, Section 8. And my personal favorite, it was an aesthetically displeasing eyesore visible from the community's primary walking trail. Omarta had to laugh at that one. The trail in question was on the complete opposite side of the subdivision, separated from my range by a mile of dense, old-growth forest and a significant hill. You'd need a satellite to see my berm from there. Attached to the list of grievances was the penalty, a fine of $500 per day, retroactive to the date they first became aware of the construction. The total due was already a staggering $7,000. It was an attempt at financial shock and awe, designed to make the average person panic, fold, and beg for mercy. I was not the average person. I spent the next 2 days composing my response. It was not a letter, it was a package. The cover letter was polite, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. It stated simply that the Lakeside Meadows HOA possessed no legal jurisdiction over my property, parcel number 75-83-04-B, as recorded by the County Registrar of Deeds. I referenced the specific state statutes governing the formation and authority of homeowners associations, highlighting the requirement for voluntary accession for properties not included in the initial plat. Then came the exhibits. Exhibit A was a certified copy of my property deed, clearly showing its date of purchase and legal description, predating the HOA's existence. Exhibit B was the official county plat map, with my parcel outlined in red, showing it as distinct and separate from the Lakeside Meadows subdivision plat. Exhibit C was a copy of the Lakeside Meadows Master Declaration itself, which I had obtained from the County Records Office, with the list of included properties highlighted. My parcel number was conspicuously absent. Exhibit D was the sworn affidavit from Silas, my original attorney, attesting to the fact that my property was intentionally and legally excluded from the HOA's purview from its inception. I put it all in a crisp professional binder, made 3 copies, and sent the original to the HOA board via registered mail with return receipt requested. 1 copy went to my personal file, and the other went into a new, thicker binder labeled Karen. I knew with a certainty that chilled my bones that this was only the beginning. A rational person or a rational board would have received my package, consulted their lawyer, and realized their mistake. They would have issued a retraction and an apology. But Karen was not rational. She was a tyrant, and tyrants do not comprehend retreat. They only understand escalation. 2 weeks passed in silence. I half hoped my irrefutable documentation had done the trick. Then the second envelope arrived. It was thinner this time. Inside was not a legal argument or a rebuttal of my evidence. It was simply an updated invoice. The daily fines had continued to accrue. The new total was over $14,000. And at the bottom of the page, a single chilling sentence was typed in bold. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in the placement of a lien against your property. That was it. No acknowledgement of my detailed legal response. No attempt to justify their jurisdiction. Just a doubling down on the threat. She was ignoring the law, ignoring the facts, and attempting to steamroll me with sheer brute force intimidation. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. A lien on my property was a direct assault on my family's security, a black mark on the title that could complicate everything from refinancing to eventual inheritance. It was a legal cudgel designed to bully me into submission. I stood in my kitchen, the letter trembling slightly in my hand, not from fear but from a cold, rising anger. Sarah saw the look on my face. "They didn't listen, did they?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "No, they didn't." I walked back to my desk and picked up the phone. It was time to stop being a civil engineer and start being a combat engineer. It was time to move from defense to offense. The first phase of my operation would be intelligence gathering. I needed to know everything there was to know about Karen, her board, and the weapon she was wielding against me, the HOA itself. The military teaches you that you never engage an enemy without first understanding their organization, their strengths, and most importantly, their weaknesses. Karen had made the HOA her weapon, but that weapon had rules of engagement, bylaws, and state laws that governed its very existence. It was time for me to turn that weapon back on its wielder. My first official act was a formal request, sent again by certified mail, citing the relevant sections of the state's Planned Community Act. I demanded a complete and unredacted copy of the HOA's financial records for the past 5 years, including all budgets, balance sheets, income statements, and records of reserve funds. I also requested the minutes of every board meeting and every architectural review committee meeting for the same period. Under the law, they had to comply. This was the bureaucratic equivalent of a reconnaissance in force. While I waited for that data to arrive, I began my on-the-ground intelligence operation. I started taking walks through lakeside meadows in the late afternoons when people were getting home from work, tending their gardens, or watching their kids play. I wasn't there to complain or rally troops, not yet. I was there to listen. My first encounter was with a man named David, who was meticulously trimming the hedges in front of his immaculate home. I introduced myself as his neighbor from up the hill. His friendly demeanor cooled slightly when I mentioned my name. "Ah, you're the one with the gun range," he said, the words chosen carefully. I nodded. "Just wanted to introduce myself properly. I'm Jack Caldwell." He relaxed a bit, seeing I wasn't there to pick a fight. "David Garcia," he said, offering a hand. "Listen, for what it's worth, my boys think what you're building is the coolest thing ever. But you should be careful. Karen's got you in her sights." I learned that David and his wife had been fighting the Architectural Review Committee for 6 months over a swing set for their 2 young sons. The model they'd bought was made of sturdy, weather-treated pine. The committee, which was essentially just Karen and 2 of her cronies, had denied it because the approved material was a specific brand of recycled plastic in a shade of prairie taupe. The dispute had generated hundreds of dollars in fines and a pile of threatening letters. My next stop was a few houses down, where a lovely older woman, Mrs. Henderson, was tending a small but vibrant flower bed. Her garden was a riot of color except for one small, empty patch of mulch near her front door. I complimented her roses and we fell into easy conversation. It didn't take long for the topic of the HOA to come up. Her eyes clouded over. "Oh, that Karen," she sighed. "She made us get rid of Bartholomew." Bartholomew, it turned out, was a cheerful garden gnome that her late husband had given her 30 years ago. It had sat in that exact spot for the 2 years they'd lived there without issue. Then one day Karen had driven by, and a violation notice appeared in their mailbox. "Unapproved statuary," it said. The fine was $50 a month until Bartholomew was removed. My George, he would have fought her, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice thick with emotion. But I don't have the energy anymore. So I put him in the garage. A gnome. They had terrorized a grieving widow over a garden gnome. The pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't about maintaining community standards. It was about the exercise of arbitrary power for its own sake. It was about the pleasure Karen derived from bending others to her will, no matter how petty the issue. A few days later, a large, heavy box arrived from the HOA's management company. It was my requested documents. I spread them across my dining room table, which was soon covered in a sea of paper. It was exactly what I'd expected, a mess. The financials were a disaster, full of vague line items, questionable expenses for consulting, and a reserve fund that was dangerously underfunded. But the real gold was in the meeting minutes. I read through years of them, highlighting every instance of a denied request, every fine levied, every contentious vote. The minutes were sanitized, of course, but the pattern of Karen's iron-fisted rule was unmistakable. She was the only one who ever spoke at length. Motions were proposed by her, seconded by one of her 2 loyalists on the 5-person board, and passed with a consistent 3-2 vote. The other 2 board members seemed to be either perpetually absent or voted against her with no effect. Then I found it. It was in the minutes from a meeting 3 years prior. The agenda item was community boundary harmonization. The description was innocuous, but the attached motion was breathtaking in its audacity. Karen had proposed that the board vote to formally incorporate adjacent, undeveloped, or standalone parcels into the jurisdiction of the Lakeside Meadows HOA for the purpose of maintaining a consistent aesthetic and ensuring the safety and property values of all residents. My parcel number was on the list. The vote was, as usual, 3-2 in favor. It was a complete legal fiction, of course. An HOA board can't just vote to absorb property that doesn't belong to it. It's like me voting that my neighbor's car now belongs to me. It's meaningless without the owner's consent and a formal, recorded change to the deeds. But it was the smoking gun. It was proof of intent. Karen knew my property wasn't in her domain, and she had tried to pull it in through a sham vote. This wasn't a mistake. It was a conspiracy. She had been planning to come after me for years, just waiting for an excuse. My shooting range was the excuse she had been dreaming of. I carefully scanned the document, saved a digital copy, and placed the original in a protective sleeve inside the Karen binder. The intelligence gathering phase was complete. Now it was time to bring in the heavy artillery. The next morning I was on the phone scheduling an appointment with a lawyer. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. While I was confident in my own research, navigating the legal system is like navigating a minefield. One wrong step and the whole thing can blow up in your face. I needed a professional, an expert guide. I found her through a veterans network, a woman named Ann Davies. The reviews were glowing. Bulldog, relentless, knows property law backward and forward. Her biography mentioned that her father was a retired Marine Master Gunnery Sergeant, which told me she'd understand the mindset. Our first meeting took place in her downtown office. It was neat, organized, and functional, not ostentatious. Mrs. Davies was in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense haircut. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. "My paralegal said you have an HOA issue. Let's see what you've got." I didn't give her a long, rambling story. I simply opened my briefcase and placed the Karen binder on her desk. "It's all in there," I said. "Chronological order. All documents are certified copies or originals." For the next 20 minutes, she was silent, turning the pages with a practiced efficiency. She scanned my deed, the plat maps, the HOA's declaration. Her eyes narrowed slightly when she got to the violation notices and the escalating fines. When she reached the meeting minutes detailing the illegal annexation vote, a small, grim smile touched her lips. She closed the binder and looked at me. "Mr. Caldwell, in my 10 years of practicing law, this is one of the most flagrant, amateurish, and legally baseless cases of HOA overreach I have ever seen. This isn't just a mistake. This is malicious." It was a profound relief to hear a legal expert confirm my own conclusions. "So what's our move?" I asked. Our first move is to put them on formal notice that they have poked a bear, she said, her voice hardening. We will send a cease and desist letter so sharp it will give them paper cuts. It will demand the immediate cessation of all harassment, a full and formal rescission of all fines, and a written letter of apology. It will also put them on notice that any further action, specifically the filing of a lien, will be met with a lawsuit for damages that will make their heads spin. She drafted the letter right there with me in her office. It was a thing of beauty, a multi-page document citing case law, state statutes, and the HOA's own bylaws against them. It was a legal broadside, and we sent it via courier to the HOA's registered agent that very afternoon. I felt a surge of confidence. The tide was turning, but I had underestimated Karen's capacity for self-destruction. A week later, Miss Davies called me. Her voice was cold as ice. Jack, I have some news. They've done it. They've actually done it. Done what? I asked, a knot tightening in my stomach. They filed the lien. It was recorded with the county registrar this morning. $21,500 plus filing fees. I was stunned into silence. It was an act of such breathtaking stupidity. They had received a detailed legal warning from a reputable law firm, laying out exactly why their actions were illegal and the consequences of proceeding, and they had proceeded anyway. This was no longer just Karen's personal vendetta. She had now made the entire HOA board complicit in an illegal act. She's trying to force our hand, Jack, Ms. Davies explained. She's betting that you'll be so terrified of the lien that you'll cave and pay her off just to make it go away. She thinks this is a game of chicken and she's driving a bulldozer. What does this mean for us legally? I asked, my voice low. It means the gloves are off, she replied, a hint of predatory excitement in her tone. They have now inflicted a concrete, legally recognized injury. We're no longer just talking about harassment. We're talking about slander of title. We're filing suit tomorrow morning. We'll sue the HOA as an entity, and we will name Karen and every board member who voted with her, personally. We're going to ask for actual damages, punitive damages, and all of our attorney's fees. We are going to make them rue the day they ever heard the name Caldwell. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked out to my back porch and looked out into the darkness, in the direction of the range. The lien felt like a physical violation, a stain on the land I had worked so hard for. It was a cloud on the title, a bureaucratic anchor chained to my home. Karen had crossed a fundamental line. She hadn't just insulted me or tried to find me. She had attacked the very foundation of my family's security and my legacy. In the military, when an enemy escalates from pot shots to direct artillery fire on your command post, you don't just return fire. You call in an airstrike. I sat there in the cool night air and thought about Karen's next move. She had tried rules. She had tried fines. She had tried legal intimidation. What was next? What would a cornered, power-mad zealot do when their traditional weapons failed? The answer came to me with a sudden, chilling clarity. She would try to have me declared a criminal. I went back inside and walked to my gun safe. I opened it and looked at my collection. Each firearm legally owned, meticulously maintained, and safely stored. I thought about my workshop, where I reloaded my own ammunition and occasionally did minor gunsmithing, all perfectly legal hobbies. And I knew with absolute certainty where her next attack would come from. And I knew I had to be ready. Karen's next move was as predictable as it was pathetic. Having failed to intimidate me with bylaws and liens, she resorted to the last refuge of a petty tyrant, calling the cops. The first call came on a Saturday afternoon. I was at the range with my son, Mark, who was home for a weekend before leaving for Fort Benning. We were going over basic rifle marksmanship, the same drills I had learned 30 years ago. We had just fired a 5-round group when we heard the distant sound of a siren. A few minutes later, a county sheriff's deputy cruiser rolled slowly up my long driveway. A young deputy got out, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Caldwell?" he asked. "Yes, deputy. What can I do for you?" I said, walking to meet him. Mark stood by the bench, rifle pointed safely downrange, action open. "Sir, we got a noise complaint, report of automatic gunfire." I had to suppress a smile. We were firing a bolt-action .22 rifle. It made about as much noise as a vigorous cough. "Deputy, you're welcome to inspect my firearm. It's a standard bolt action. As for the Bussamos, my property line is over there," I said, pointing toward the woods. "The nearest house in Lakeside Meadows is a half-mile away, and as you can hear, it's pretty quiet out here." The deputy nodded. He could clearly see the situation for what it was. He could probably hear the birds chirping more clearly than our shots. "We have to respond to every call, sir. Sorry to bother you." He got back in his car and left. This happened 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. Each time a different deputy would arrive, I would politely explain the situation. They would see the absurdity of the complaint, and they would leave, increasingly annoyed at the waste of their time. The last one, a grizzled sergeant with tired eyes, shook his head. "Look, Mr. Caldwell, we know who's making these calls. Her name is Karen, right? She calls about something every other day. Just be aware. She's a squeaky wheel, and sometimes command gets tired of hearing it." I thanked him for the warning. I knew Karen's frustration was mounting. The local police were no longer a viable tool for her harassment campaign. So, true to form, she escalated. She went federal. It was a Tuesday morning when they arrived. I was in my workshop, cleaning my rifles, when I saw the 2 dark sedans pull up the driveway. They were immaculate, with government plates. 2 men in suits got out. They moved with a purpose that local law enforcement didn't have. They were feds. They walked to my front door and knocked. I met them on the porch. "Mr. Jack Caldwell?" the taller of the 2 asked. He flashed his credentials. "Special Agent Miller, ATF. This is Special Agent Evans. May we have a word with you?" My heart didn't race. My palms didn't sweat. I had been expecting this. This was Karen's airstrike. "Of course, gentlemen, please come in," I said calmly. I led them to the living room. Sarah, seeing the serious expressions in the suitors, quietly went to the back of the house, but I knew she was listening. "Sir," Agent Miller began, "we've received a series of anonymous tips regarding this address. The allegations are serious. They include the operation of an illegal militia training facility, the manufacturing of unregistered short-barreled rifles, and the improper storage of explosive materials, specifically reloading powder." I listened without expression, letting him finish. The allegations were designed to be terrifying, to trigger an aggressive no-knock raid. But my calm demeanor and cooperative attitude had clearly led them to take a more measured approach. "Agents," I said, leaning forward slightly. "First, I am a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I take federal law, and especially firearms law, very seriously. Second, the anonymous tipster is almost certainly the president of the neighboring HOA, a woman named Karen, with whom I am currently in a significant legal dispute. She has been harassing me for months. I have documentation to prove it." I paused, letting that sink in. "Now, as for the allegations, I do not run a militia camp. I run a private range on my own property for my own use and to train my son, who is about to join the Army. All of my firearms are legally owned and registered as required. I do not manufacture any illegal weapons. I do engage in the hobby of gunsmithing, which is perfectly legal. And I do store reloading components, including smokeless powder, in accordance with all state and federal regulations, as well as the National Fire Protection Association guidelines." I stood up. "Would you like a tour?" They exchanged a look. This was not the reaction of a man with something to hide. "We would," Agent Evans said. For the next hour, I gave them the grand tour. I started with my gun safe, a massive fire-rated vault bolted to the foundation of the house. I opened it and showed them my collection. I handed them my folder containing the acquisition and disposition records I meticulously kept, even for private sales where it wasn't required. They checked the serial numbers on a few rifles against their database. All clean. Next, I took them to my workshop. It was organized and spotless. My reloading press was bolted to a heavy bench. My components were neatly labeled. I showed them the powder storage, a dedicated, fire-resistant wooden cabinet kept in a cool, dry room, exactly as the regulations prescribed. They were visibly impressed. Finally, I took them out to the range. I showed them the berms, explained the engineering, and pointed out the safety features. Agent Miller, the taller one, looked at the setup and then back at me. "You were an engineer," you said. Corps of Engineers. My specialty was base construction and fortification, I replied. He nodded slowly. Then his eyes caught a plaque on the wall of my small range shed, a farewell gift from my old unit. He walked over to it and read the inscription. He turned back to me. The 36th Engineer Brigade. You were with the Ruggeds? All 25 years, I said. A smile broke across his face. I was 82nd Airborne. We had some of your guys attached to us in Afghanistan. You guys build good stuff. The tension in the air completely dissolved. We were no longer federal agent and potential suspect. We were two veterans. Agent Evans, the younger one, sighed and shook his head. Sir, I apologize for taking up your time. It's pretty clear what's going on here. It's a vindictive complaint, Agent Miller added, his voice now laced with anger. A complete waste of our time and your time. We take this sort of thing very seriously, Mr. Caldwell. Filing a false report with a federal law enforcement agency is a felony. He handed me his card. Our investigation into these allegations is closed. However, we will be opening a new one into their source. We'll be in touch. As they walked back to their cars, I knew the game had changed. Karen hadn't just called in an airstrike on me. She had accidentally called it in on her own position. And the full weight of the federal government was about to come down directly on her head. The visit from the ATF was the fulcrum upon which the entire conflict pivoted. Karen, in her blind rage, had made a catastrophic error. She had escalated beyond the petty fiefdom of the HOA and had drawn the attention of an entity that operated on a completely different level of power and consequence. She thought she was using the federal government as her personal attack dog. She was about to find out what happens when you lie to men with badges and nationwide jurisdiction. I immediately called Ms. Davies and told her everything that had happened, from the agent's arrival to the handshake with Agent Miller. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then she let out a low whistle. Oh, she is well and truly cooked, Ms. Davies said, the satisfaction in her voice palpable. Jack, this is the hammer. This is the whole ballgame. Maliciously filing a false federal report, not just a crime, it's a bad faith action so egregious that it blows up any defense she or the HOA might have had. Their insurance carrier is going to run for the hills. She explained the legal implications. Our existing lawsuit for slander of title and harassment was strong, but this new development was a game changer. We could now add counts for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and malicious prosecution. The potential for punitive damages had just gone up by an order of magnitude. We're amending the complaint first thing in the morning, she declared. We're going to detail the ATF visit. We're going to state that the HOA president is now under federal investigation for her actions related to this dispute. When their insurance company's lawyers see that, they're going to start asking some very hard questions of Ms. Karen. But legal strategy was only one front in this war. The other front was public opinion within the community. For months, Karen had controlled the narrative, painting me as a dangerous outsider and a threat to their peaceful suburban bliss. It was time to shatter that narrative with the truth. My new allies, the Garcias and Mrs. Henderson, were my initial command staff. I met with them in my living room, laying out the recent events. When I told them about the ATF raid, David Garcia's jaw dropped. Mrs. Henderson put a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. She called the feds on you, David said, shaking his head in disbelief. That woman is unhinged. This has gone way beyond garden gnomes and swing sets. She's dangerous. That's exactly the point we need to make, I said. For years, she's ruled by fear, picking you off one by one over petty issues. People are afraid to speak up because they think they're alone. We need to show them that they're not. And we need to show them that her personal vendetta against me is now putting the entire community at financial and legal risk. The story of the ATF call began to spread through lakeside meadows like a spark in dry grass. I didn't have to do much. David talked to other dads in the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson spoke with her friends in the gardening club. The narrative shifted almost overnight. I was no longer the scary gun guy. I was the respected veteran who had been unjustly targeted by an out-of-control HOA president. People who had been fined for leaving their trash cans out too long or for planting the wrong color of petunias started to connect the dots. They saw that the same arbitrary and vindictive power that had been used against them had been escalated to a federal level against me. Their fear of Karen began to be replaced by a shared sense of outrage. The HOA's insurance policy, like most, covered the board for errors and omissions, but it almost certainly contained an exclusion for willful misconduct, bad faith actions, and criminal behavior. Ms. Davies' amended lawsuit, which now included the ATF investigation, meant that the insurance company could potentially deny the claim, leaving the HOA and, by extension, every homeowner paying dues, on the hook for the massive legal judgment we were now seeking. The financial threat was the final piece of the puzzle. It transformed the issue from a personal dispute into a community-wide crisis. It wasn't just my house on the line anymore. It was everyone's money. We had the moral high ground, and now we had the financial leverage. The time was right to bring the fight to her doorstep. Using the procedures outlined in the HOA's own bylaws, we collected signatures from more than 25% of the homeowners, forcing the board to call a special meeting. The official purpose stated on the petition was to discuss the ongoing litigation involving Mr. Jack Caldwell, the associated legal costs, and the conduct of the board president. It was a formal challenge to her authority, a public accounting she could not avoid. The trap was set. Karen, blinded by her own arrogance, would walk right into it, expecting to shout down the opposition as she always had. But this time, she wouldn't be facing a lone homeowner. She would be facing an organized, informed, and angry community, and I would be there, binder in hand, ready to present the irrefutable evidence of her malfeasance. The battle for Lakeside Meadows was about to reach its climax. The night of the special HOA meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. It was a sterile, beige room that usually hosted potlucks and holiday parties. But tonight, the air was thick with tension. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the back and side walls. I saw the Garcias near the front, giving me a determined nod. Mrs. Henderson was there with a group of her friends, their expressions grim. These weren't the usual 5 or 6 residents who showed up to regular meetings. This was a significant portion of the entire neighborhood, drawn by the scent of blood in the water. I took a seat in the front row, my Karen binder resting on my lap. Ms. Davies had advised me on the strategy: let Karen run her mouth first. Let her dig her own hole. At the front of the room, the 5 board members sat at a long table. Karen was in the center, gavel in hand, flanked by her 2 loyalists who looked deeply uncomfortable. The other 2 board members, a quiet accountant named Frank and a young mother named Brenda, looked terrified but resolute. They had been the consistent no votes against Karen for years, and tonight they knew they had backup. Karen banged the gavel, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. This special meeting of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association will come to order, she announced, her voice tight with forced authority. The sole agenda item is the ongoing legal matter with Mr. Caldwell. Due to the sensitive nature of active litigation, discussion will be limited. We will begin with a statement from the board. She then launched into a 10-minute tirade, a pre-written speech filled with self-serving justifications and veiled accusations. She painted herself as the valiant defender of the community, protecting their property values and safety from a reckless and non-compliant individual. She referred to my range as a paramilitary installation and hinted at disturbing activities that had necessitated contacting the appropriate authorities. She never mentioned the ATF by name, but her implication was clear. She was trying to reframe her harassment as due diligence. This board, she concluded, her voice rising, has acted decisively to protect this community from a clear and present danger. The legal actions we have taken are necessary to compel compliance. Any costs incurred are a small price to pay for the peace and security of our neighborhood. She looked out at the crowd, expecting applause or at least tacit agreement. Instead, she was met with a wall of stony silence. She faltered for a moment, the smugness draining from her face, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Then David Garcia stood up. "A question for the board," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You mentioned protecting property values. Can you explain how a 6-figure lawsuit, which we, the homeowners, will have to pay for, protects our property values, especially when it turns out the HOA had no jurisdiction in the first place?" Karen's face flushed. "That is a matter for the courts to decide." "You are out of order," she snapped, banging her gavel. Then Mrs. Henderson stood up, her voice trembling but firm. "I have a question, Karen. You fined me and threatened me until I took my late husband's garden gnome out of my own flower bed. You told me it was an unapproved eyesore. Was that protecting the community, or was that just being cruel?" "That is irrelevant to this meeting," Karen shouted, her composure cracking. One by one, more people stood up. A man asked about the thousands of dollars spent on legal consulting before I was ever sued. A woman demanded to know why the reserve fund was so low, while the board was spending money on frivolous enforcement actions. It was a dam-breaking, years of pent-up resentment flooding the room. Karen was losing control, her face a mask of fury as she hammered the gavel fruitlessly. Finally, it was my turn. I stood up, and the room fell silent. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse. I just held up my binder. "My name is Jack Caldwell," I began, my voice calm and measured. "For the past several months, Ms. Karen, in her capacity as board president, has waged a campaign of harassment against my family. She has levied over $20,000 in illegal fines. She has filed an illegal lien against my home. And when that didn't work, she filed a false report with federal law enforcement, triggering an investigation by the ATF into my family on fabricated charges." A collective gasp went through the room. "I have here," I continued, opening the binder, "a copy of the board meeting minutes where Ms. Karen led a vote to illegally annex my property. I have copies of every letter, every threat. And thanks to the legal discovery process, I have something else. I have her emails." I held up a single sheet of paper. The silence in the room was absolute. "This is an email from Karen to another board member, sent the day after my lawyer sent the official cease and desist letter. I'll read it to you." I cleared my throat. He can have his fancy lawyer send all the letters he wants. I told our guy to file the lien immediately, even if he thinks we should wait. It's time to crush this soldier boy and run him out of our neighborhood. He has no idea who he's messing with. The impact of those words was like a physical blow, the raw personal venom, the undisguised malice. It stripped away any pretense that her actions were for the good of the community. It was a vendetta. Everyone in that room heard it. I wasn't finished. And here is another email to her friend on the board after she called the ATF. "The feds are on their way to his house now. Let's see how tough Mr. Army Man is when he's in handcuffs. This will be the end of him. Best money this HOA ever spent." The room erupted. People were on their feet shouting at the board table. "Resign! Shame! That's our money." Karen's face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. She looked at her two cronies on the board, but they were staring at the table, refusing to meet her eyes. She looked at Frank and Brenda, who were looking back at her with undisguised contempt. Her power, built on a foundation of fear and bluff, had evaporated in the space of 30 seconds, incinerated by the public exposure of her own words. Frank, the accountant, leaned into his microphone. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the din. "I believe this situation warrants a motion," he said. "I move for a vote of no confidence in our board president, Karen, and for her immediate removal from the board of directors." Brenda immediately seconded the motion. Karen stared at them, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She was utterly, completely defeated. The tyrant had been dethroned in a public spectacle of her own making. The vote of no confidence was a landslide. It wasn't even close. Karen's two sycophants, seeing the tidal wave of fury in the room and realizing their own potential liability, abstained, leaving Karen completely isolated. The motion to remove her from the board passed with a thunderous chorus of ayes. She sat there stunned, as Frank, now the acting president, formally declared her removed. She gathered her papers with trembling hands, her face a blotchy mess of white and red, and scurried out of the clubhouse through a side door, pursued by the angry glares of the homeowners she had once terrorized. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The tension broke, replaced by a palpable sense of relief and empowerment. For the first time in years, the residents of Lakeside Meadows felt like they were in control of their own community. The new interim board, led by Frank and Brenda, immediately scheduled a meeting with Ms. Davies and me for the following day. There was no more bluster, no more threats. The meeting was somber and professional. Frank, a man who clearly understood numbers and liability, was appalled when Ms. Davies laid out the full scope of their legal exposure. The slander of title, the malicious prosecution, the federal investigation into Karen's actions. It was a disaster. Our insurance carrier has already sent us a reservation of rights letter, Frank admitted, rubbing his temples. They're signaling that they may not cover any judgment against us because of Karen's willful and criminal actions. We're in serious trouble. You are, Ms. Davies agreed, her tone unsympathetic. Your previous board, under Karen's leadership, followed her down a path of reckless illegality. However, my client is not an unreasonable man. He's a man of principle. He doesn't want to bankrupt this community. He wants justice, and he wants to be made whole. The settlement negotiations were swift. The new board had no desire to fight a losing battle. They agreed to every one of our terms. First, the HOA would pay a substantial settlement directly to me. It covered every penny of my legal fees, which were significant, and a further sum for damages related to the harassment, the slander of title, and the emotional distress caused by the federal investigation. It was a number that made Frank wince, but he knew it was a fraction of what a jury would likely award. Second, they would issue a formal public apology to me and my family. This apology was to be drafted by Mrs. Davies, printed on official HOA letterhead, and mailed to every single homeowner in Lakeside Meadows. It would explicitly state that the HOA had acted without legal jurisdiction, that the fines and lien were illegal, and that the board deeply regretted the actions of its former president. Third, the illegal lien was to be immediately and permanently expunged from the county records at the HOA's expense. Finally, the HOA's bylaws were to be amended to include a new section written by Ms. Davies, explicitly preventing the board from taking any legal action or filing liens without a majority vote of the entire board and a formal written opinion from a qualified attorney confirming the legality of the action. This was my Karen clause, designed to prevent any future tyrant from hijacking the HOA's power. But for me, the true justice was yet to come. While the civil suit was being settled, the federal investigation was proceeding with grim efficiency. With subpoena power, it took the ATF approximately 5 minutes to trace the anonymous tips back to Karen's personal email address and cell phone. There was no hiding. A few weeks after the settlement was finalized, I was cleaning my truck in the driveway when an unmarked government car pulled up. It was Agent Miller. He got out and walked over, a grim look on his face. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "just wanted to give you an off-the-record update. This morning, the U.S. Attorney's Office unsealed a federal indictment against Karen. One count of making false statements to a federal officer and one count of obstruction of justice." I just nodded, letting the weight of it sink in. This wasn't an HOA fine for an unapproved garden gnome. This was the full, crushing weight of the United States federal justice system. "What happens to her now?" I asked. "She's facing felony charges," Miller said flatly. "If convicted, she's looking at prison time. At the very least, her life is about to become a whirlwind of lawyers, court dates, and financial ruin. People seem to think they can use us to settle their petty grudges. We like to disabuse them of that notion." The news broke a few days later. Her mugshot was on the local news website, looking haggard and defeated under the harsh lighting of a booking photo. The story detailed her fall from grace as the powerful HOA president, now facing serious federal charges. The final brutal irony came from the HOA itself. The new board, on the advice of their new competent lawyers, filed a civil lawsuit against Karen personally. They were suing her to recoup the settlement money they had been forced to pay me, arguing that her criminal actions had caused the financial damages to the community. Her insurance wouldn't cover her for a criminal act, and the HOA was coming after her personal assets to pay the bill. She was ruined, financially, socially, and legally. She had tried to destroy my peace and my home, and in the end, she had only succeeded in destroying her own. The months that followed were quiet, a welcome calm after the storm. The moving trucks came for Karen's house in late autumn. The bank had foreclosed on it after the HOA's lawsuit, and her mounting legal fees had pushed her into bankruptcy. I watched from my porch as her gaudy furniture and boxes of possessions were loaded up. There was no satisfaction in it, not really. Just a quiet sense of an inevitable conclusion. She had sown the wind, and now she was reaping the whirlwind. Her downfall was a textbook case of self-immolation, fueled by an arrogance so profound she couldn't see the cliff she was sprinting towards. The Lakeside Meadows HOA underwent a renaissance. With Karen gone, the atmosphere of fear and petty tyranny evaporated. Frank, the reluctant but capable new president, worked with the community to overhaul the covenants. The absurd rules about mailbox colors, garden statuary, and swing set materials were purged. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community building. They hosted a neighborhood barbecue, the first in years. David Garcia's boys finally got their swing set, and he proudly sent me a picture of them laughing on it. Mrs. Henderson quietly put Bartholomew the gnome back in his rightful place in her flower bed, a small but potent symbol of the restored order. I received the formal letter of apology, as promised, in the mail. It was a masterfully written document by Ms. Davies, a complete and total vindication. But the real apology came in 100 smaller ways. In the friendly waves I now got from neighbors as I drove past, in the conversations I'd have at the local hardware store, in the sense of no longer being an outsider to be viewed with suspicion. I was just Jack, the guy up the hill. My son, Mark, came home on leave before his first deployment. He had finished basic and AIT, and he carried himself with a new maturity, a quiet confidence that made my heart swell with pride. We spent an entire afternoon at the range, just the two of us. The air was crisp and cool. The rhythmic crack of the rifle fire no longer felt like an act of defiance, but an expression of freedom, of peace hard won. As we packed up our gear, Mark paused and looked out at the massive earthen berm. "You know, Dad," he said, "I was worried when all that stuff with the HOA was going on. I thought she might actually win." I slung my rifle case over my shoulder. "Son, there's a lesson in this. Bullies and tyrants, they thrive on fear and intimidation. They win when good people get scared and back down. But their power is a house of cards. All it takes is one person to stand up, to be methodical, to refuse to be intimidated, and the whole thing comes tumbling down." "You didn't just fight for a shooting range, did you?" he asked, his eyes showing he already knew the answer. "No," I said. "I fought for the principle. I fought for the right to be left alone on my own property. I have fought for Mrs. Henderson's gnome and for David's kids' swing set. You don't get to pick and choose which hills you'll defend. You defend the line." Later that week, a new family began moving into Karen's old house. I was out walking my property line, checking the fence posts near the road, when the new owner, a young man about 30, saw me and walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You must be Mr. Caldwell," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Tom. We're the new owners." "Jack," I said, shaking his hand, "welcome to the neighborhood." He smiled, a genuine friendly smile. "Thanks. Hey, I heard a bit about what went on here before we bought the place. From what the realtor and some of the other folks said, sounds like you're the guy who saved this neighborhood." I looked past him, at the rows of houses where kids were now playing freely in their yards, where neighbors were talking over fences without fear. I looked back towards my own woods, my sanctuary, secure and inviolable. The war was over. The peace was won. I gave him a small, satisfied nod. I'm just a guy who doesn't like bullies. The fight had cost me time, money, and a great deal of stress. But as I stood there on my land, the air clear and the future peaceful, I knew it had been worth every second. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a line held, and a community restored. And sometimes it's the simple sound of silence where a tyrant's voice used to be.